Romans themselves imagined we might marvel at them long after their builders were gone.
Will anyone compare the idol pyramids to these great aqueducts, these indispensable structures? Anonymous.
Public baths, fountains, and even the wealthiest homes were provided with clean running water. Sewers channeled waste into rivers or seas, providing a level of sanitation not matched for nearly 2,000 years and still not met today in some parts of the world. On the whole, the provinces thrived under Roman rule. But if many enjoyed the prosperity of empire, what of those who suffered cruelly to provide it? There was a well-known saying in ancient Rome: "Every slave is an enemy we harbor." Indeed, every master feared his slaves, some with very good reason. By the 1st century AD, the number of slaves had skyrocketed. Now an astonishing 1 in 3 inhabitants of the Roman Empire was a slave, around 16 million people. Slaves still worked the fields, but now many also toiled in mills, gold and silver mines, and other labor-intensive industries.
The slaves in the mines thronged, all in chains, all kept at their work continuously day and night. No one could look upon the squalor of these wretches without feeling compassion for their plight. They may be sick, or maimed, or aged, but there is no indulgence. All alike are kept at their labor by the lash until they die in their torments, and death is welcomed as a thing more desirable than life. Diodorus Siculus.
In the cities, the lot of a slave was often better. Some were well-educated tradesmen or doctors. A select few even had positions of power and influence. But the vast majority of slaves were laborers, bred and treated like farm animals.
There are those who will say, well, it wasn't so bad to be a slave. Look at slaves, educated slaves, who were treated very well by their owners. Cicero treats certain slaves as friends. Wet nurses were often very much favored by the children that they nursed, and so on. But that, I think, is a pernicious way of looking at slavery and excusing it. The reality for the vast majority of the slaves in the Roman world was that life was nasty and short and brutish.
Though some escaped and a few managed to buy their freedom, most slaves had no real hope of liberty. For them, there was only one option left: organized rebellion. Sicily, 140 BC. The rich island was notorious for its savage treatment of slaves. Over the previous decade, a large number were imported to supply grain to an insatiable empire. Many of the recent arrivals were former soldiers of high rank, unaccustomed to being treated like animals.
The Sicilians, having grown very rich and elegant in their manner, bought up large numbers of slaves and immediately branded them. They treated them harshly, worked them too hard, and cared nothing about their food or clothing. Beaten and mistreated almost beyond reason, the slaves could no longer patiently endure. Diodorus Siculus.
There were large concentrations of slaves on these farms, and they were very often of the same nationality. One of the pieces of advice that was given by later people to slave owners was to make sure that you mixed the nationalities, that you didn't have this sense of unity.
Among the newcomers was a Syrian named Eunice, he was a well-liked man who many believed had magical powers. One day, some slaves came to ask his advice. Was it wrong to kill a master whose cruelty and torture were beyond all endurance? Yunus considered the question carefully. His answer was action. He rallied and armed 400 fellow slaves. Yunus led his rebel army on a rampage of pillage and murder, killing every master they could find. The slaves proclaimed Yunus king, and their revolt caught fire. Armed with axes, meat hooks, hatchets, clubs, whatever they could find, including kitchen utensils, the slave army soon exploded into a force 70,000 strong. As word spread, uprisings broke out all over the empire, even in Rome. Smaller revolts were put down quickly, but in Sicily, Yunus's troops often outnumbered the Roman soldiers they fought. For 7 bloody years, the war raged on. When Rome finally sent enough forces to quell the rebellion, the legions massacred 20,000 slaves. They were crucified, hung in chains, or hurled from the city walls. To the very end, Yunus fought on, but Roman legions captured the beloved slave king. His gruesome fate was to die in prison, his body eaten away slowly by lice. It was the first true slave revolt against Rome, but it wouldn't be the last. The gap between rich and poor had become a gaping chasm. The poorest were wretched, while the top of the heap were as wealthy as the empire herself. And the Roman Empire was rich. While the empire grew, there was good reason for Rome's fantastic wealth. With each new conquest, the spoils of the world flooded into Rome. It was an unbeatable formula. Constant victory in war brought a steady flow of gold, riches, and slaves. As long as Rome won rich new territories, she would continue to flourish. In the 1st century AD, the empire's population was around 50 million people and still growing. With little central planning and scant mass production, the empire managed not only to feed its huge army, but also its poor. About half of all people living in cities depended on the government's grain dole, something the poor had come to think of as a right, along with games in the arena.
You hear the expression bread and circuses, and really it's bread and games, food and games. It was the government giving people what they wanted to keep them happy. The same way that we have tax deductions, and we have holidays, and we have other things to keep our citizens happy, so did the Romans provide this kind of fun and games for people. And ultimately, if anything, it was part of what drew down the empire. Eventually in Rome, you had 170 days of games. That's really 170 holidays. That's half the year, figure it out.
Beginning in 31 BC, the famous Pax Romana was a period of splendid prosperity for the great empire. 2 glorious centuries of peace and order blessed Rome and her colonies. And even now the empire grew, in the 2nd century AD, shifting eastward to add Mesopotamia, Syria, and Arabia. The empire now stretched 3,000 miles from end to distant end. Riches continued to pour in. The population grew. People lived longer lives, and the land yet gave forth its generous bounty. It must have seemed like Rome could go on forever. Prosperity is a quality difficult to measure. And even harder to pinpoint is the moment prosperity begins to fade. Did anyone, farmer, soldier, slave, or craftsman, mark the day the Roman Empire ceased to rise? Though far bigger than any other ancient city, Rome never grew much larger than 1 million people. After 106 AD, the empire too ceased to expand.